Hi everyone, and welcome back to the second video for Module 1 of the History of Christianity 1 course. In the previous section, we talked about why we should study history and what we can gain from doing so. In this section, we'll look at how to study history well. Now, I'm not talking about such things as reading the textbook and studying hard and being a good student. You should do that, and we talked about that in the requirements and resources section, but that's not what we're addressing now. In this section, we'll look at the kind of things we can learn from history and how some ways of investigating and applying history are more helpful than others. Let's talk about what we can learn from history. First, I want to remind you of this diagram. Learning theology and history can give us clarity to see the world accurately and understand what is going on and why, and this helps us see both the urgency and opportunity of our own situation, which helps us discern the right strategy of how to live well and please God. Now, let me introduce the next concept by telling you a parable. There once were four neighbors who lived on the same street, and it just so happened that they all bought new vehicles at the very same day and drove them home at exactly the same time. The first one said, "I just bought a new Ferrari. It is the best because it can go 180 miles per hour. The second one said, "I just bought the economy two-door. It is the best because it gets 180 miles per gallon. The third one said, "No, I just bought a Super Duty pickup truck, and it's the best because it can haul 180 tons of payload." And then the fourth one said, "I just bought the deluxe passenger van. It's the best because it can carry 180 people at a time." So, which one is right? Who bought the best vehicle? Well, we're all entitled to our opinions, but the point of this parable is that we can't actually answer that question until we first answer a more fundamental question. Now, we often just assume the more fundamental question, but we shouldn't. We must first ask the question of purpose. Because if the purpose is to go fast, then one vehicle is the best. But if the purpose is to haul a lot of things or a lot of people, then the Ferrari is a terrible choice. In the same way, when looking at history, one of the most important questions is the why question. Learn to ask the why question in order to understand history. Why did they do this? Why did that happen? What were they trying to accomplish? Is that something that they should have been trying to accomplish? Then and only then can we understand and evaluate how successful they were and determine whether their actions were beneficial for that purpose or not. But it's even bigger than this. History's kind of like an iceberg, in that what is below the surface is bigger than what is seen. What we see in behavior and actions is a small percentage of the whole. People's behavior is determined by their values, what they think is good and worth pursuing. And values are determined by beliefs, what people think is true. And beliefs are determined by worldview, what people think is real. And our worldview is determined by our theology, what we think is the ultimate reality and standard of everything else. So, looking at purpose is necessary. It is a good start, but it is not yet enough to study history well. Now, let me give you an example to make this point. Genghis Khan set out to conquer the world and ended up killing a lot of people in order to do so. And he was extremely successful in conquering a huge empire, which covered a large chunk of Asia and Europe. Does that make it a good thing just because he was successful in doing what he intended? Because not all purposes are good. We need to take purpose into account to understand why things happened, but we need something bigger than just purpose to evaluate history. Or to put it another way, we need a way to judge between competing purposes. Because Khan wanted to conquer, but the other people wanted not to be conquered. Was his purpose better than theirs just because he succeeded? Now, it's been said that history is written by the winners, but how can we evaluate between competing purposes and standards. How can we evaluate history if the winners wrote it from their side? Well, as Christians, we believe we have an eternal, objective standard from God Himself. And I hope that as we go through history, you look at it through the grid of God's standards and God's purposes. Now, in the Old Testament, it sometimes says that so and so did what is right in God's eyes, or somebody else did what was evil in God's eyes. And we should ask that kind of question of all of the history that we examine. In God's sight, was that good or bad? Was God pleased with what so and so did or not? And we should not only evaluate the purposes according to God's standards, but we should also evaluate the methods according to God's standards. Let me make another illustration. If my friend was hungry, should I steal food for him? It would stop him from being hungry. Wouldn't that be a good thing? But the problem is, stealing is worse than hunger. And also, I could have fed him in good ways. It's the same as the old statement, the ends don't justify the means. A good purpose does not make it okay to use evil methods. We must think about purposes, but also think about the way that people tried to accomplish them. Let's look at it another way. The foundation of everything is theology. That is, the truth about who God is and what He is doing and how He typically does things in the world. All that God has revealed in the Scriptures. From that we learn, among other things, we learn general principles of how we should live and act in a way that is fruitful because it is faithful to God and His ways. And then, in doing history, we notice what certain people did in their certain context. And we notice how it played out in a certain time and place and culture. But there's where it sometimes breaks down, because we see the methods that worked in a particular culture and context, and we try to just import the same methods into our time and place and culture, and we're surprised when they don't work in the same way. Because we can't just package methods without going back and wrestling with the underlying principles and theology. The theology doesn't change. The principles should be very similar because God does not change. But we might need to go back and relearn the underlying principles and theology, again, the why question, in order to devise methods that are faithful to the principles and faithful to God's character, but are also appropriate for our own time, place, and culture, which is the how question. Now, rarely can we do exactly what they did and expect the same result. But we can learn the underlying reasons, motivations, strategies, and try to translate them into our own context, all guided by God's standards revealed in the Bible. The how can change, but the why should be eternal. Now, all of this so far is somewhat theoretical. Let me now transition to attempt to make it more concrete. However, because these days there are many competing voices and controversies about history itself, including some dishonest people doing some really bad history, I need to take some time to make some cautions about how not to do history. And then I'll offer some alternatives and strategies how to do it better, more accurately, and more faithfully. There are a variety of ways that history has been done badly, and we could spend hours looking at them in detail, but I don't think you would like it at this point. So I'll try to simplify and summarize all of them in two categories: bad thinking and acting in bad faith. First, try to avoid sloppy thinking when you do history. Don't think that the past is just like the present, because it's not. Not only did they not have computers in their pocket, but in many ways they thought and lived differently. There's a saying that history is like a foreign country. We go there and meet people who are different, who think and act differently, and we realize how much we take for granted. many of the ways of thinking we assume to be normal are only normal to us because someone in the past changed it and taught us to think in a different way than had been thought before. So understand and evaluate each issue according to its own time, standards, and opportunities. Now, on the other hand, don't think the past is completely different than the present. They were people just like us, trying to make the best of their lives in situations given to them. They weren't stupid, and we should not dismiss them as ignorant just because they didn't have airplanes. Believe their own testimony and understanding of what happened unless you have overwhelming evidence to doubt what they said. Next, don't think certain people are automatically equated with certain ideas and actions. We need to be able to distinguish between them and to think clearly about the differences. Now, let me illustrate and try to explain what I mean by that. Hitler was an evil, evil man who did evil, evil things. No doubt about that. But I'm guessing he believed in gravity. He probably thought the grass is green and the sky is blue. Does that therefore mean that it is evil to believe those things because Hitler did? Am I just like Hitler if I believe in gravity? Well, why should I let Hitler determine what I believe one way or the other? In other words, the things he did were not evil because Hitler did them. Hitler was evil because of the evil things he did. Hitler does not get to determine good and evil. Only God does. So we don't evaluate things by comparing them to Hitler or any other historical person. We evaluate them by comparing with the eternal objective standards from God. So if Hitler did at least one good thing in his life, we should be honest and say that was good, in spite of all his evil. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse the evil in any way. It just demonstrates our honesty and accuracy. Now, on the other hand, people and actions are often connected, and we cannot completely divorce people from their ideas and actions. So, because Hitler has proven himself to be on the side of evil, I can strongly suspect that the majority of things he did were tilted toward the side of evil. And because Augustine has proven himself to be godly and wise in so many ways, I can start with the assumption that he was a good guy and give him the benefit of the doubt, while still being honest that he did some bad things whenever the evidence demonstrates it. And that's all related to the next point, which is don't think everything is simple and uniform. Don't think it's all or nothing, that people are either perfect angels or total devils. History is complicated. Don't throw the baby out with the dirty bathwater. Morality is still objective and black and white, but it is often lived out in difficult gray situations. So use common sense and honestly evaluate history. Now, I need to acknowledge, in order to look at 1,500 years of history in one course, we have to dramatically oversimplify in order to be able to get a handle on everything that happened. So generalizations are unavoidable, but they're sometimes not the entire story. So even as we work through a general overview of history and a general summary, even as we try to simplify things in order to understand them, keep in the back of your mind that life is not as simple as a history overview can make it seem. And don't lose proportion. There were good things in the past, and there were bad things that happened. But not every good thing was the greatest thing, and not every bad thing was absolutely the worst. There are a lot of dishonest people today making a living by playing the victim, and they may indeed have been victimized. But we need to recognize that almost everyone in the entire world has been a victim in some way or another. And we need to honestly ask whether one form of victimhood is more urgent than others. If someone is making a big deal about injustice that happened centuries ago, but completely ignores that same injustice happening right now, then they probably don't care about justice as much as they care about how they can benefit from playing the victim. Now, that doesn't mean that we should ignore or downplay injustice, but rather, let's be wise and honest in understanding it in the big picture. So, no sloppy thinking when we're studying history. However, avoiding bad thinking is only half of the battle. Like I've mentioned, there are not only unintelligent ways of doing history, but also dishonest ways of doing history. Not just bad thinking, but acting in bad faith, which we should also avoid. Now, sometimes people have studied history with ulterior motives, and therefore have skewed the evidence to make a conclusion that favors their cause. Beware of listening to people who use history this way, but also beware of falling into that trap yourself. Here are some examples of the kind of attitude we should avoid. First, avoid arrogance and judgmentalism when looking at history. It is tempting to look down on certain people and events in the past and think, oh, I would have done so much better than that, or to think that you're better than them. Well, no, you're not. And if we were in their place, we would be just as likely to make the same mistakes. And the evidence for that is all the mistakes that we've made in our own lives in the past, and the mistakes we're currently making in the present. So please don't assume that everyone before you was an idiot. And don't judge without fully understanding what was going on in terms of their own situation, their own mindset, and their own options. And only judge by God's standards, not our own preferences. Second, beware of importing ideas into a historical situation that were not really a part of what was going on. Many people have their pet issues, and it's tempting to make every situation about that particular issue, whether that issue is really central or not. Try to understand every historical situation on its own terms, and don't force your own ideas and expectations onto it. And the previous two mistakes are combined in the danger of tribalism, which is also known as postmodernism or Marxism. When it comes to history, this approach desires to see everything from a predetermined standpoint and bias, and will intentionally twist everything to conform to a group ideology, even if it means being inaccurate or dishonest to do so. Now, I hope you don't think I'm being unfair in stating it that way, because those kind of groups, they clearly say that's exactly what they are trying to do. They claim that their utopian goals justify any means to get there, even dishonesty. But they're doing exactly what they're accusing others of doing. They say that history has been evil and unjust because it favored one group over another. And so, they are working to flip it to favor their group over others. But how is that not just as evil and unjust by their own standards? Now, of course, we're trying to study history from a Christian standpoint. So someone might ask how we could fault someone else for studying history from their biased standpoint. And that's a fair question, to which we should give a response. There are three reasons I would give. First, everyone has an ultimate standpoint. It's just that ours is the eternal God, who actually is the eternal standpoint, not just for history, but for everything. Our ultimate is not just our subjective preference or group identity, but our ultimate is the Lord of history. Therefore, secondly, we believe that history is real and objective and knowable, because it is not just our group construct, but it conforms to reality, what actually happened. Of course, we can't know it exhaustively, but we can genuinely know the truth of history without bias, to the extent that our knowledge conforms to the real world, which is what conforms to God's knowledge. And finally, as Christians, we are committed to integrity and following the truth wherever it goes, even if it makes us look bad. We might not always live up to our ideals, but we are trying in that direction. Let me put it this way. Who would you trust more? Someone that is committed to being truthful, even if they occasionally fail, or someone else who doesn't care about the truth and has clearly said they're going to lie whenever it suits their purposes? Which one of those would be more trustworthy and accurate? Now, all of this is to say, avoid the spiritual mistake of making history about you or your group. History is what it is without your input. It's not there for you to like or dislike. It is there for you to learn from. And it's not there for you to use to claim to be virtuous. It's there to help you actually to be virtuous and wise by learning from the good and the bad, and by being virtuous in the way that you learn history. And this leads into looking at some ways to do history well. The antidote to bad thinking and bad faith, not surprisingly, is good thinking and good faith. I've already touched on some of these issues, but let me summarize. Think well, think hard, think accurately about history. Genuinely understand what happened, including the reasons and motivations why it happened, as far as we are able to learn. Understand it in terms of their time and place, their way of thinking, and the options that were available to them. Understand the complexity, but try to see the general summary principles and patterns that arise from the complexity. And try to understand the past in the big picture, that they were taking the first steps to get where we are now. And we would not be where we are, for better or worse, if they had not taken those steps. A scholar named Thomas Sowell has some very helpful questions to ask to help you think and discern well. First, ask, how do you know? Find out what evidence can be found for any event or issue, and separate the evidence from the interpretation of the evidence, and ask whether a particular conclusion is justified by the evidence. Second, ask, compared to what? Think about what other options were available to the people and events that you study. What else reasonably could they have done in their situation? And what have other people in history done in similar situations? Third, ask, at what cost and consequences? In making evaluations, notice what were the costs and benefits of any particular event, both short-term and long-term. We see throughout history that short-term trade-offs were sometimes harmful in the long run. So learn wisdom from that short-sightedness. Think well when studying history. And one more thing I want to mention in terms of thinking well is to distinguish the descriptive from the prescriptive. Just because something happened doesn't make it good. Just because something is described as happening does not make it prescribed as what should happen. Just because a Christian did something doesn't make it good necessarily. Just because a non-believer did something doesn't make it bad necessarily. Although we should expect a Christian to do good more often. It is often helpful to keep separate the question of what happened from the question of what should have happened. Learn what happened first, and then ask the evaluation kind of questions. And those evaluation kind of questions demand that not only should we have good thinking when studying history, we should do it with Christian virtue, which includes humility, integrity, etc. Have a good level of understanding before you start to evaluate and make judgments. Make judgments fairly and honestly based on God's standards and not on your own preferences. Try to hear from both sides before you make up your mind about a controversial issue. Be humble about the past. We are no better or smarter than people in the past, and except for God's grace, we would make the same mistakes. And only by God's grace can we see similar successes. And from all that, try to learn wise lessons and apply those lessons in your own life. Try to work the iceberg understanding actions from values and values from beliefs and worldviews. In other words, try to connect all that you learn in history to the theology that drove that history. And hopefully you'll learn that some theology is better than others. The more faithfulness to biblical revelation and a Christian worldview that people have had, the better historical decisions those people have made, and the better results and fewer failures they experienced. And try to apply your own Christian faith to how you learn history and how you apply what you learn to your own life and ministry. So now let's review. We should learn history in terms of what happened, but also why it happened. Ask the purpose question. And evaluate by God's standards. Avoid illogical thinking when you do history, and avoid immoral prejudice when you do history. Rather, pursue clear and accurate thinking and virtuous discernment in evaluating with God's standards, and apply these lessons with wisdom to your own life. And that brings us to some questions for discussion. First, how can thinking about the past in terms of purpose and the iceberg help us to understand it better? What insights do you hope to gain by looking at history in this manner? How do you think it would help you to be wiser and a more virtuous person? Second, what are some examples of bad thought or bad faith in discussing history that you've seen? What mistakes of this sort have you made in thinking about the past? And what mistakes have others around you made? And what can you do now to protect yourself from making the kind of mistakes that you and others have made in the past? And finally, describe the kind of good, faithful thinking about history that you would aspire to in this course and beyond. What steps can you take to grow toward that ideal? How can you strive to involve God in your study of history? And how can you study history in a way that is pleasing to Him? Now, I encourage you to wrestle with these questions, as well as the questions of the previous section in your own mind and in discussion with others. So this is the point that I will pause, and you should pause the video in order to think through and discuss with others these applications. And when you're finished with that, continue the video, and I'll come back with some guiding principles that may spark more ideas, discussion, and insights for personal application. So pause now for discussion. Now, let's continue with some guiding principles. And my suggestions about this introductory material should not surprise you. We should learn about the past in their own terms, not importing our own issues. Humbly try to understand what happened and why it happened. Try to discern God's evaluation about what was good and what was bad by His standards. Try to learn wise principles which you can apply in your own part of history, and actively try to wisely apply these lessons in your own life and ministry. All right, that wraps up this section. I hope you've been challenged to study history well and to avoid bad approaches, and I pray that you've been given tools and strategies to help you do so. In the next section, we'll start to actually look at Christian history, starting with the time of Christ and the early church. And I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.